here, and apparently we're live too, but people are watching on live stream, they can't see the audience, so I have a vast revolutionary army just outside of the frame, a couple of thousand people here. Here to see tonight's talk, the second in a series of, I believe it's 19 talks that are part of Miami Summer School. Really great program, and so let me jump into what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So my session is called Medicare for All, the Libertarian Socialist approach to Medicare for All. And just to introduce myself, my name is Jonathan. I'm a member of Miami DSA. I'm also a member, as of recently, of Black Rose Anarchist Federation. And so I'm going to be giving kind of like a critique and an evaluation of Medicare for All, basically from a libertarian socialist perspective. But I'm going to stop here. Some of you might be asking in confusion and wonderment, libertarian socialism, what does that mean? So I want to break that down just so we have a good analytical framework, which we can then proceed and kind of look at Medicare for All. So libertarian socialism, of course, we have the first part of that, libertarian, kind of a dirty word in United States politics, but I want to throw that kind of garbage free market version of libertarianism out for a moment so we can talk about what it really means, in terms of politics historically, right? So just kind of describe it, an emphasis on freedom and self-determination, and particularly in opposition to relationships based on domination, most notably the state, but also just social hierarchies in general based on gender, race, ability, particularly economic equality, obviously, exploitation, among other things. Then the second I have here read, socialism, right, which, I'm just kind of giving a very quick hit definition, but really what I mean is a society based on democratic and cooperative control of the means of production, right? That's actually part of DSA's mission statement as well. Essentially, democratic control of the means of production down to the workplace and community level, right? It's a very important distinction from other types of socialism that are based on, say, not so democratic forms of politics, right? And then finally, putting them together, libertarian socialism, what do I mean by that? And again, it's a very basic definition. So building socialism outside of the formal political system, right? So outside of Congress, outside of political parties, outside of, kind of the central government bureaucracy, let's say, right? Particularly, right, alternative institutions, right? So building new institutions to bring about the change that we want to see. Among them, there are many, but of course we have rank and file unions, popular neighborhood assemblies, cooperatives, and also practices, by which I mean, things like not only protest, but direct action and mutual aid, some things that we're going to be talking about today, based on direct democratic principles, right? So not, where essentially everyone has a say, right? Everyone has an equal part, and where power essentially flows from the bottom up. So let's move on here. Medicare for All, just, kind of an overview of the session. I'm going to be talking about the limitations and possibilities of Medicare for All, right? This is not just a critique. I'm going to be talking about some of the positive aspects, but I'm also going to highlight how we can use kind of libertarian socialist ideas to kind of push the struggle even further, right? And really kind of push past just the legislation that's on the table, kind of looking at a more holistic kind of objective for the movement. Okay, so what is Medicare for All? I'm sure a lot of people in the crowd are familiar with it. Some of you watching at home are as well. But it is essentially a movement in the past couple of years that has been pushing for universal health care in the United States. And just some of the basic, characteristics against a for-profit health system, particularly health insurance companies, right, would be pushed out by having, universal health care coverage, universal comprehensive coverage, meaning applying to everyone, at least within the United States for now. Right, and then finally, free at the point of service, meaning none of the dreaded co-pays that I'm sure we're all familiar with. And in addition to that, in terms of the role of DSA, this is a Miami DSA event. DSA has made, at the national level, Medicare for All one of the pillars of its national strategy. Right? So they've been putting a lot of effort behind it. Various chapters have been canvassing, holding events. Activists are going around the country promoting Medicare for All. And really, I would say the centerpiece, or kind of the most tangible aspect of this movement is, here at the bottom of the screen, the Sanders Medicare for All Act, which was introduced in 2017. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later. I'm just kind of introducing the idea right now. I'm going to go into it in more detail later on, but in some ways that's a centerpiece, right? That's one of the main forms of legislation that is kind of purported to carry this out into practice, Medicare for All. Okay, and this is just a statement from the National Political Committee, it's kind of the executive body of DSA, when they endorsed the Sanders bill. Just a little bit of a quote here. They said, there are still ways the bill can be improved. Our job as socialists is to keep pushing the envelope and raise expectations of what's possible under a Medicare For All system. And really, this is my entry point for tonight, right? I really want to push the envelope using ideas that are maybe a little bit more radical than what some socialists are affiliated with. But hopefully I can demonstrate that this is actually necessary to get universal health care, not just kind of a one-off reform. Okay, and just some of the basic overview themes for tonight. First, this is a really big one. Reform is important, right? Reforms like Medicare For All, like others in U.S. history, things like the 8-hour working day, minimum wage. So reform is important in and of itself, but how we get there, right? How people mobilize, in some ways, is more important than actually getting it, right? There are versions of reform that are actually demobilizing, right? That kind of put the emphasis for change inside the formal political system and shut out a majority of people and communities from actually participating. It's very important for our themes tonight, right? Especially vis-a-vis Medicare For All. And this kind of led me to think, and this is sort of a process over a couple of months, where I started thinking, well, if I have this critique of Medicare For All, what are some examples, right? These revolutionary situations. What did people do with regard to healthcare, right? So what were some of the measures that they implemented? And I ended up looking at Spain. There's some, but not that much literature about kind of how healthcare was reorganized, right? Particularly by anarchists in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. We're going to be talking a lot about that. And then finally, I'm going to take some of those basic principles and just sort of apply them, kind of throw them back at the Medicare For All movement, and kind of end on a couple of suggestions of, again, how can we push the envelope, to paraphrase what I had in the previous slide. Okay, so starting with Spain, and again, Spain's kind of the main example, not the only one. There are other notable examples of this sort of revolutionary attitude towards healthcare, but Spain kind of jumped out for a few reasons that will become clear in the next few slides. First of all, just a little bit of a review of the history, and I'm sure everyone here is more or less familiar with what happened, so it's going to be a little bit of a retread. But in 1936, in July, right in the summer of 1936, there was an attempted right-wing military coup. And Francisco Franco, who later became the dictator of Spain, kind of emerged as the head of that sort of right-wing military rebellion. And in response, right, other factions of the left in Spain, you can say, were ill-prepared to really beat back that rebellion, with the exception in a lot of urban areas. And I have a map of Spain here, so you can see, particularly in the northeast of Spain, Catalonia most prominently, workers, and particularly anarchist workers in the cities, were the most successful at beating back the fascist forces, right? At least for a while. Ultimately, of course, Franco won, right? The Spanish Civil War kind of concluded with the right wing becoming emergent. But for a while, anarchists were kind of at the forefront of the effective, armed resistance. And so, kind of two of the main players, and we've been talking about quite a bit, the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, the CNT, so kind of the largest labor union, right, that were guided by anarchist principles, founded in 1910. Then the second one was a smaller group of ideological anarchist militants, the Federación Anarquista Ibérica. So they're a much smaller group. But the two actually merged together in 1936. You have this very militant and strongly organized fighting force, right? Not only ideologically, but militarily. And so alongside that, right, alongside the Civil War that came about, there was a social revolution. And so anarchists, again, were at the forefront of this movement of organizing collectives, right? Factories that were run along capitalist lines. Managers were often run out or were kind of forced to work alongside their workers in collectives and cooperatives in urban areas in the countryside as well. Radical socialists participated in some of these developments. There's a little bit of a controversy. This is really an interesting point. I say it's a controversy because it's still debated and hotly contested. So anarchists at the end of 1936, they were asked to join what was left of the Spanish government, right? The Spanish Republic that was fighting Franco's forces. And they actually ended up, for a period of time, joining this governing coalition, the Popular Front, which is made up of all these different left-wing groups, everyone from Stalinists to Trotskyists to moderate socialists. And all of a sudden, for, what was maybe the first and only time in history, you have anarchists entering into this established government, right? Still it kind of elicits a lot of heated debate even today. And so this is just some of the CNT FAI propaganda. Okay, so, as part of this entry to the Popular Front, and again, it's a really interesting optic, right? Anarchists actually emerged as the head of government departments, right? So they're given cabinet agencies. And for our purposes, health is kind of the most important one, but, think of this, an anarchist was in charge of the Ministry of Justice for a period of a couple of months, as well as the Economy Ministry, right? So these three, in particular, cabinet-level agencies were run by anarchists for all intents and purposes, and this was, particularly in 1936 up until kind of mid-1937. And so in the Ministry of Health, right, what happened is, obviously there was sort of a compromise where, actually I'm going to jump ahead a little bit just so we can get a look at the health minister, Federica Montseny, Catalan anarchist, actually second generation. Her parents were also working class anarchist militants. So she ran the Ministry of Health, and under her tenure, she reduced bureaucratic posts, right? So kind of minimized the staff, advanced issues like abortion and birth control, which even inside that left-wing Popular Front coalition, there were very controversial issues, right, at the time. And also provided resources to worker-run healthcare facilities, right? That's, it's going to be very important for what we talk about later. And so, this experiment ultimately didn't last a very long time, right? So again, around, the summer of 1937, the other parts of the Popular Front pushed the anarchists out. So the anarchists were stripped of their, kind of cabinet agencies. But, within that time, there was a lot of really vital dynamic experimentation. And ultimately, it's partially because the other partners in the Popular Front coalition, even some so-called communists, actually opposed things like collective businesses and cooperatives, right? They were actually the moderate forces, some would say the brakes on the social revolution that was happening in 1936 and 1937. Okay, but, it's not only a question of government ministries. The CNT, which had existed since 1910, they embraced a revolutionary type of unionism, right? Their goal was to get, kind of like the industrial workers of the world, get all the working class of Spain into one big union. And that was a key in terms of healthcare as well, partially because, they organized doctors and healthcare workers along with other industries. So, even before 1936, what they were able to do is essentially guarantee that CNT members could get healthcare from other CNT members, right? That was a really important way of providing healthcare to workers on, on the basis of kind of an egalitarian arrangement. So you could say it was like mutual aid as much as anything. And also after the Civil War started in 1936, a lot of the healthcare workers were organized into one big union, the Sindicato de Sanidad, that in 1937 had up to 40,000 members in the part of the country that was still controlled by the Spanish Republic. And this was very important because they were able to articulate a more holistic vision of what healthcare would look like in a post-capitalist society, in a classless society, an egalitarian society, and a lot of that revolved around healthcare facilities that were run by the workers themselves, right, on an egalitarian basis, where you didn't have that internal hierarchy. And, not only healthcare, but like the sort of definition, the conception of healthcare was expanded beyond what was traditional at the time in the 1930s. So they even referred to things like sporting facilities, public swimming pools, right? So they had this really expansive and idealistic vision of what healthcare could be. It's very, it's a far cry from what later occurred under kind of social democratic universal healthcare arrangements. This was a lot more ambitious, I guess you could say. And so these facilities, they did receive some support from existing state structures. Like I said, the Ministry of Health was run by a militant anarchist. So, once he was able to direct some resources to these kind of cooperative healthcare enterprises. And that, that kind of created a situation which I think you could refer to as dual power. So you have these healthcare facilities that were being run on an egalitarian basis where decisions were being made by assemblies of workers. But, they still had a formal relationship with what was left of the Spanish state. So not perfect, but certainly run on a different basis, on an alternative basis. And then finally, mutual aid networks. I have that kind of at the bottom of the slide here. What I mean by that is that anarchists organize sort of informal groups of doctors and healthcare workers to provide healthcare at low cost, right? Outside of the state, basically. And I have a quote here just to demonstrate it. This is from Robert Alexander. He wrote a gigantic tome about the Spanish Civil War, 2 volumes, 1,200 pages. It is available on libcom.org. If anyone's interested, shout out to libcom. I'll just read the quote here. So what he said about the organization of these cooperative healthcare facilities, right? Those who are in charge of the various levels of the system were elected by the appropriate general assemblies of workers. Once a week, the Central Committee of the Sindicato, the union, met with delegates from the 9 primary subdivisions of the system to coordinate activities, right? So we have this constant communication, you have representation going from the bottom up. It's something that, in the context of modern U.S. healthcare, almost seems unimaginable, but it's something that, hopefully I can convince you that, is something we need to push for, right? It's something that we should be talking about, something that we should include in propaganda around Medicare for All. Okay, now, since I talked about Spain a little bit, again, Spain is not the only example. You could point to examples like Chiapas, right, in Mexico, where you have a very similar system of community-level healthcare, of kind of worker cooperatives essentially administering healthcare to members of their own communities. But, I don't want to kind of keep this presentation going for too long, so I'm just going to slide past that. But what I'm going to do is take some of the principles that I talked about in regards to Spain and kind of bring them to bear in a critique of the Sanders Medicare bill. So again, like I said, this was introduced in 2017. It was kind of the centerpiece, and I think still is a centerpiece to a great extent of the Medicare for All movement. Moving forward here. So I read through this document. You can find it online. It's something like 96 pages, I believe, but I kind of did the legwork so you don't have to. But please feel free to, after the presentation, check on your own. I just want to talk about some aspects of the bill that I think, even though they purport to offer universal health care, actually create some troubling loopholes and create some spaces of concentrating power. Whereas in Spain, I feel like there is a tendency to, kind of disperse power and promote equality and kind of an egalitarian way of administering healthcare. The first one, this is a really big one, right? If you read through the bill, you see that the implementation of this kind of universal healthcare system is almost entirely in the hands of the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which is a cabinet level agency. So HHS, kind of acronym there, they would have the power to open regional offices, so it's very top down, right? In the sense that they're the ones that kind of open these regional offices in various states and localities in a time when something like health deserts is a huge problem, right? There are communities without access to healthcare, but they don't necessarily have the ability to do more than make requests on the Secretary of Health and Human Services, right? It's very huge power imbalance, in my opinion. And a big one here, the guidelines for training, education, quality are determined by all these different bureaucratic entities. I describe it like a Russian nesting doll. So let me just read a part of the act so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. So there's established within the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality Office of Primary Healthcare, responsible for coordinating with the Secretary, the Health Resources and Services Administration, and other offices in the department as necessary. So you have 3 or 4 bureaucratic departments we mentioned here, none of which have any direct relationship with unions or communities, and they're all essentially out of our control. Right? We really don't have much influence over this process. Even when it comes to something as simple as setting, basic guidelines, right? Things like professional development, training, best practices. And so just to kind of bring my point home, this is Donna Shalala. Does anybody know who Donna Shalala is in the crowd?
Yeah.
So unfortunately, someone in the crowd said, yes, I concur. So she was actually the HHS secretary under Bill Clinton, right? After she left office, she worked with various property development companies, including Lennar. Some of you have seen Lennar developments in Miami. She, made a lot of money in the private sector. Parlaying a relationship she made while in office. She was against the legalization of marijuana. And notably, in terms of Miami history, right, let's not leave it unsaid, she was president of UM in 2006 when the janitors went on strike. She opposed the strike tooth and nail. The janitors and the student allies had to go on a hunger strike to actually win, right? So you have Donna Shalala, right? So my question here is, if you have someone like this as the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and if they have a kind of, inordinate amount of power over implementation, do you think we're really going to get Medicare for all? It's like, I know a lot of activists are imagining that we might get a progressive administration, a Bernie Sanders, or, something on that order, what about the next administration? And what about the next one after that? So when you get a Donna Shalala, who's running for Congress right now, by the way, I'm sure some of you know that. When you get someone like that, is the letter of the law, even if it is passed, will it be implemented, right? Like, how many loopholes will come about because of people that have sort of other sets of interests that they're guided by that have nothing to do with quality healthcare for all. And so just a couple of other things too. Another big part of the bill is that HHS would negotiate drug prices. So some of you that have been following healthcare know that the Obama administration notably left this off of the table during the run-up to Obamacare and the creation of the Affordable Health Care Act. So seems like a good thing, right? They have the ability to negotiate drug prices. They can kind of use their leverage to maybe get cheaper prescription drugs for all of us. But again, that problem of an imbalance of power and competing sets of interest, it gives us two possible scenarios that I wanted to point out. Again, as a productive critique of the act. I'm trying to be productive in kind of my commentary here. So the first one is that, again, pharmaceutical companies, just like, say, military contractors, could get sweetheart deals, meaning when prices are negotiated, they might get really favorable quotes, actually. They might be able to, kind of have kind of create cost overruns, right, to get sweetheart deals when they negotiate with the HHS secretary. And so, this does a few things, right? It creates a positive situation for them, should that happen. But it also creates cost overruns. And when you have that, it actually creates an excellent pretext for privatization, right? People might say, oh, this is too expensive, right? This is spiraling out of control. Now, we know with the military budget, that doesn't really happen. But unfortunately, the political class don't prioritize healthcare quite as much. So I can foresee a scenario where you would have that first option, right? You'd have that first possibility. Then the second one, this is really not about pharmaceutical companies only, but actually all healthcare providers, right? They're not really regulated very tightly by the bill, but, if they have to operate, let's say they have to provide, they kind of have to operate along the guidelines of the bill, provide healthcare to a vastly expanded customer base. If they experience any losses, they might simply pass them down to their workers in the form of things like speed ups, right? Just, kind of further overburdening healthcare workers who work at, healthcare provision facilities. And, things like layoffs, speed ups, familiar tactics, right, in terms of capitalism, in terms of the business class that they impose on workers in order to maintain their own profits. We can see that happening, and part of that is sort of explained in the following point, why that's so relevant, is because the bill really doesn't have a lot of language pertaining to healthcare workers. There's really not a lot for labor in the bill. Perhaps I missed something. I'm sure, if we have any eagle-eyed people watching on the live stream, maybe they'll leave a few comments, correcting me or not. But as far as I could see, there really wasn't much for labor, for healthcare workers that are infamously overburdened, that have to deal with, subpar Medicaid reimbursements, things like that. And I'm talking even down to the level of home care aides, people like that. They're not really taken care of in the bill. There's not a lot for them there. And so, and again, in combination with, the previous bullet point, that could create a really untenable situation for the people who are actually on the front lines, for people who, are just going to be further overworked and not really get much in terms of guarantees of unionization or higher wages from the bill, right? That would require a separate campaign. And why this is important is because, healthcare workers constitute a very diverse population, particularly in the context of Miami. A lot of healthcare workers are composed of women and people of color, right? So there's also that aspect to think about as well. And then finally, this is sort of the last thing, and perhaps this is a product of political expediency, but a lot of the unions that support Medicare for All have really been kind of silent on this issue, as far as I can see. I'm a little bit of an outsider, but, I haven't seen a lot of talk about labor standards, under the Medicare for All bill, which again, even creates a huge problem. They actually, they're supposed to represent nurses, they're supposed to represent these different categories of healthcare workers. So, there needs to be some kind of advocacy. Largely the support has been in general terms, right? In kind of the general principle of, universal comprehensive coverage. Not a lot of attention for the people who are providing that coverage, for the people who work in lines, for the people who work in, healthcare facilities, right? So that's like a big concern of mine. and perhaps something you share as well. And as far as suggestions, and these are really like loosely articulated. Really, my goal is that you guys can take some of these points, internalize them, and if you know healthcare workers, if you operate in activist spaces that have to do with healthcare, maybe you could bring some of these principles in, because that's really what we need to kind of radicalize the discourse beyond what has been done already. So the first point, just use examples like Spain. I mentioned Chiapas and others to articulate a set of what you might call offensive reforms, right? That we're pushing for comprehensive universal Medicare coverage, healthcare coverage, but we also want to abolish capitalism. We also want We also want a classless society, and there's no piece of legislation that's going to guarantee that. And to the extent that we do support reforms like this, because it is needed, right? There are people that need immediate relief. We also need to do that parallel to articulating principles of wanting something more, right? Because not doing so kind of opens us up to getting co-opted by politicians. And when we go hand in hand with politicians running into the sunset, it creates certain compromises that radicals and activists are often on the losing end of, right? So that's kind of my contention here. And just a couple of general principles, going back to the example of Spain, the idea of federative organization, right, from the bottom up, like even in the workplace level, that, let's say in a hospital or a healthcare facility, that the people who work there actually have a say in how things are administered. They actually have a say over things like schedule, over workload, over over staffing, things like that really don't exist now. The second kind of related point, workers' control, meaning at the workplace level, you don't have a hierarchy. You don't have a sort of coordinate hierarchy of people kind of ruling over you, right? Because that's sort of the last bastion. Well, probably not the last bastion, but one of many in contemporary U.S. society where we really don't have democracy. If we don't have it in the political system, we definitely do not have it in the workplace. So it's the idea of workers' control is very important as well. The next one is it's kind of a half-baked point maybe, but I want to bring it up. In the United States, there are a lot of grassroots healthcare collectives that provide services to communities free of charge or on a sliding scale, that work outside of the formal healthcare system. And they are extremely important because they often operate kind of on this libertarian socialist basis, if not explicitly, then implicitly. And I think if we're talking about transforming healthcare alongside transforming society in an egalitarian way, I think these kind of collectives need to be at the base of that kind of strategy. I don't know how many exist in Florida, but certainly you have many around the country working in low-income areas, working among marginalized communities, vulnerable communities. And so, finding some way to turn this into a mutual aid economy where you have, kind of like I mentioned with the CNT, right, where CNT members were getting free healthcare from CNT doctors. Being able to do something like that with healthcare collectives would be, a fantastic step forward. A hell of a lot of work, I'm not going to lie. I couldn't tell you necessarily the first thing that we're taking that kind of strategy, but that's why I'm laying these principles out, kind of disperse them among you guys, among the people watching. So hopefully we get some movement in that direction at least. And then finally, even within the bill, as I've hopefully demonstrated, there's a lot of kind of indeterminate language, a lot of loopholes, a lot of ways that things could go wrong. Where if we get Medicare for All, it can kind of turn into a dead letter, kind of like other reform and like social aid programs in the United States. So one thing is that in spaces where we advocate for these things, even pushing for improvements in the bill would be a step forward, in terms of like labor protections, in terms of, certainly the bill has a lot of protections for, in terms of discrimination against trans folks, against people of color, and so on. But having stronger language around labor would be a big step forward. That would ensure that the bill does have some revolutionary potential, and that there is something to kind of work with moving forward, right? Kind of an organizing base that people see an improvement materially. Not just people receiving healthcare as consumers, but the workers too. This goes for the Sanders bill, and there's a similar House bill, HR 676, with which I'm not quite as familiar. But I believe that's it. Thank you very much. Original work here. So now, I gave a very brief presentation. I dropped a lot of ideas, a lot of historical context. And what I wanted to do was sort of step away from the role of presenter and be more of a facilitator. So I think if we could just kind of like organize into more of a discussion circle, any.
While that's going on, could we make the last slide, the slide that's up?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we just reorganize ourselves. My idea is that like I'll be a facilitator and I'll kind of let you guys do the talking. I've been up here, kind of doing the act for a little while, but I would like to hear from you guys and have you guys just talk to each other about what you think. If you have any ideas, suggestions, if you have any, that's kind of inspired you in any way. So yeah, let's kind of organize ourselves into a discussion circle. Yeah, what are we? I can take staff. We're not in extremely large groups, so I don't expect anyone to be fighting for the work, but I don't know if someone wants to go first. Any comments, questions? It doesn't have to be for me. It could be just general, observations.
I thought it was an excellent presentation. In fact, I like your vision so much that I'm inclined to say, yes, we should adopt at least 90% of it. Here's the issue, I think, in terms of adopting this kind of approach. It is going to be attacked. Let's assume we get Medicare for All with all its flaws, which is a huge advance over what we have now. We're going to have huge attacks from the right. We're going to have huge attacks from the center. We're going to have the bureaucratic attacks that you described in the presentation. We have to find a way as socialists to counter those. You probably agree with this. We can't wait to have the infrastructure to counter those attacks until after Medicare for All is passed, because then you're going to be fighting rearguard actions. So it seems to me we have to perform the difficult task of politicization, all the levels you're talking about, to make sure that people who are workers in the healthcare industry, or home healthcare aides, what have you, who are actively involved in shaping this thing before it gets to that point, so you have collectives already in place. Because it seems to be one of the issues that I have with the anarchist movements historically. They're so suspicious of leadership at any level. They're so suspicious of organization at any level. They're so suspicious of political articulation when it comes to the political process at the top, which they want to shy away from. So that sort of desire to make everything at the grassroots level sometimes cuts off efforts to do what needs to be done to form a lot of the things you're talking about. In other words, we as a DSA have to help organize and identify radicals and work with them, just as if they just, let's allow them to push us. But that's a politicized process that does involve some level of leadership and some level of recognized socialist, dare I say it, hierarchy in some ways. I mean, I know it's going to be offensive, but I don't see how you're going to escape that aspect of political mobilization if you're going to be successful. We can't just have a situation where when this gets established the way we want it to be established, everyone just operates in a completely decentralized mechanism. What do you do in those circumstances? You have cooperatives that are formed on a capitalist basis. What do you do under those circumstances when you have profiteers try to take advantage of the system? What do you do when people are trying to destroy the system at various levels? That's going to create tension between the hierarchy that is necessary to a certain extent to prohibit these measures and people who are supporting prohibiting these countermeasures. They're going to have to be mobilized and energized, not necessarily by a higher entity. They need to be mobilized by themselves from the group. You're going to have politicization in some ways. I mean, it's not simply going to be solved by completely sort of decentralized groups. So anyway, I've said enough about that. That's sort of my initial thing.
So I'm a little curious. even within capitalist structures, there are horizontal management styles that have been proven to work even in like large-scale corporations. So it's not as though it's an impossibility in itself. It just requires a level of organization that a lot of left-leaning organizations just don't have at this juncture. And but I don't think that makes horizontal management impossible or particularly difficult. But I do agree that the issue does need to be politicized. I think I don't really see that as a bad thing.
Anybody else any thoughts?
And I guess my critique. I mean, okay. Here's what I would say. So I think it's super important that workers in healthcare, just like workers everywhere else, have autonomy and are able to have like good working conditions and so on and so forth. I mean, the thing is, so medicine, particularly like modern medicine, which looks a lot different than medicine did in the late 1930s. I mean, it's very highly specialized, and it's very I mean, you have different kinds of doctors, different kinds of nurses, and you have if you're performing a surgery, I mean, there's somebody that's in charge, and everybody's got a specific role, and that's going to require a lot of structure, and then also in terms of we were talking about a little bit about all this before you started, but in an economy that still operates on money, where we still have to figure out who's paying people and how they're getting paid. I mean, there's got to be some standardization there, right? Because if we're going to have universal health care, then I mean the money has to come from the state, because that's who makes the money. That's who creates the money. So there's got to be a document that says, okay, here's how much this procedure costs. Here's how much that procedure costs. Here's how much, this kind of nurse can expect to get paid per hour. Here's how, it's like you've got to have a system. And, a completely cooperative collective, I think can work great for something like agriculture, where you've got a farm and everybody works on the farm, and they collectively live off the land together, and that's fantastic, and everybody they can kind of democratically figure out who does what, self-manage and all of that. But I mean, in healthcare, there's a lot of infrastructure and technology and money and stuff that's got to be pretty, that's got to cover a pretty wide area, and there's got to be some control and centralization. And so I just it's co-op hospitals without any kind of administrators or anybody to kind of any accountants or whatever. It just seems like, I don't know if that's sort of what you're suggesting, but I don't sort of see how that's compatible with the complexity of our society and of modern healthcare. I guess that would be sort of my critique. But like Ron said, I think 90% of what you're saying is great. It's just how do we what does that look like? What are the first slide that you showed was a couple of specific critiques that have already come from DSA of the Sanders bill. That's, it still allows for, for-profit medical providers, for-profit hospitals and doctors' offices and whatnot. And that's no bueno. And then, it's still, there's still going to be co-pays for prescription drugs. So that's not good. That's, I think those are great, specific things that we could put in the bill, to change it. I think that, a lot of what you're talking about is great, but it's sort of tough to think of, how you legislate a lot of those critiques into actuality, or, how you would, what would be the concrete steps of changing the organizing strategy to make those things a reality. So I don't know if you want to respond to any of that.
I definitely legislated.
Okay.
That's kind of the whole thing I was getting at. You made an interesting point about complexity, but if it's a problem here, then we're kind of screwed, aren't we? Don't we have a very complex economy? How do we, if we can't apply those principles here, what I'm suggesting is, if we can't think about it, if we can't strive for it, how are we going to do it in other sectors that are also incredibly complex? I think part of it is, there's sort of I feel like there's a little bit of a misconception at play, which is that centralization is automatically efficient and kind of a cooperative mode is not efficient. I think Spain is an interesting example in that there was sort of an attempt at collective decision-making, but federative at the same time. So there's sort of kind of bodies on kind of a larger scale. For example, the healthcare union that I mentioned that was formed in 1937, they kind of made their decisions on the basis that they kind of had all the membership kind of elect delegates and kind of went up the chain in that way. So there is a form of decision making that's not exactly centralized, but can be more all-encompassing. It's not completely decentralized, everyone's doing their own thing.
Yeah.
I think federative principles can kind of pave the way forward, in terms of managing really huge projects, whether it be in healthcare or other industries, without it being, specialized to the point where there are loopholes for the abuse of power, for example.
Right.
But if anyone else wants to weigh in, please. I spent a lot of time talking, so, by all means, weigh in.
Yeah, I believe that it's, I'm sorry, I can label it. There is a difference between decentralization and disconnection. It's not the same. So you cannot confront the decentralization as kind of disconnection. People are not disconnected on that kind of context, It's just, it works according to what you said. It's a different man. And it's been proven it works, both from anarchist experiments and capitalist experiments. So it's not a big deal. It's just take away that of hierarchy as a way to go through. That's it. Yeah. It's not much. Okay.
Okay, well, you brought up a good point, which is, what is the organizing strategy? And I can't be the only one to answer that. That's kind of an open question mark. Do you guys have any thoughts about that? Because having a system like this, it is great, but it requires a hell of a lot of work. It requires reaching healthcare workers in particular on a mass level, and we're not there yet. So how might we get there?
I think it's a multifaceted issue, and while complicated, I do think people kind of overstate its complexity. Let's take one of the steps I think you would need to take would be kind of confronting the American pharmaceutical industry. Not just in terms of overpricing and lobbying directly to doctors, but also structurally speaking, they're allowed to advertise publicly and engage in other activities that they would not be able to in other countries, period. So I think as a first step, it would be really important to just For All if the bill is being paid by the U.S. government and the prices are being inflated because the individual isn't really seeing the price at home, but it's being built to like a greater source, then they could just get away with a lot more as they are currently. So.
Yeah, I think she raises an excellent point because you have so many concentrated industries within capitalism that are fewer and fewer in number that hog the profits for themselves. It would be an industry, would be hospitals, which have essentially eradicated the smaller public infrastructure institutions. They could be much more successful if they're part of neighborhoods, if they're part of collectives, if they work closer to the people they serve, which is all the things I find attractive about your outline here. So I do think that as a precondition for some kind of success after these concentrations, to make sure they're not siphoning off the resources, to make sure they're broken up so that one of the things that capitalism does create tremendous concentrations of technological capacity, but then they're used for profit, they're not used for people's welfare. So I think by going after that and integrating this capacity within communities, that's probably a good start. And of course, would need to be, I guess, negotiated, not between the people that we're on the side of, but in other words, not between us, the power brokers, but negotiated between those of us, the majority within the population. We're setting up a healthcare system as opposed to profit. So, and of course, the left has always historically had a need for checks and balances in terms of whatever it does. I think one of the things your presentation points to is the Medicare For All system as it's currently constructed runs the risk of centralizing a lot of power at the top of the system, which then doesn't create checks and balances within the system that can protect people who are directly engaged in the day-to-day process of healthcare. The workers, home health aides, what have you. So
I'll just go a quick addendum to that, which is, the bill says that the secretary is basically, it's kind of their prerogative to seek out, kind of consult different like civil society groups, but it's very vague. Like, okay, yeah, they should consult with business groups, with labor unions, et cetera, but it's kind of completely up to the will of the secretary. So if they wanted to go to the pharmaceutical lobby, only consult with them, then they could. There's no process to kind of force them to go to the community level, really get any kind of input, any kind of critique, any kind of feedback, even, much less like actually shape the healthcare system. So that's, I kind of lead a lot on that because it's a concern.
Can you give an example of like a concrete difference in like how the day-to-day operations at a hospital would work in like, this, a kind of, a universal healthcare system, whether it's like whether it's, the Medicare For All or other systems that exist in social democratic countries where there's like a national health service that like runs all the stuff. Like can you explain how your hospital looks different than that? Like in terms of the who handles like the scheduling and or like how like what's like sort of I guess like what's the actual like breakdown of like how those differences would play out?
I mean, that's an enormous question.
Okay.
A good question, but an enormous question. I think, part of it is that, part of what's so attractive to me, or what was so attractive about this sort of example in Spain, is that a lot of questions, even at sort of the regional policy level, workers, different sectors of workers, nurses, doctors, and so on, they had delegates that were part of the process of drafting policy, of allocating resources, of even sending doctors out to different localities. And so I think more complex things like scheduling, I feel like there has to be some kind of assembly or some kind of group, at least composed of, different job classes within hospitals to settle those things.
Okay.
And which is a really vague response, but I am not a healthcare expert. My late disclaimer in this, so please forgive me, but that's kind of the
You're about to be a doctor.
they're all kind of doctors. They're all kind of.
Do we have a doctor?
Yeah.
I'm not a doctor, but I was going to jump in and say I did work in the healthcare industry, but in the aspect of manufacturing, right? And so through that, I kind of got somewhat of a sense of some aspects of the healthcare industry. And this manufacturer, they made products related to or various companies that I work for. They make products used in surgeries, right? And what you see is there's a lot of, just like pharmaceuticals, right? There's a lot of intense resources spent towards developing products that are used in surgeries. Simply just because there's tons of money, right? If someone needs, just like a drug, you have to have this drug to survive because you have cancer, right? People will pay whatever you demand, right? Surgery is the same way, right? Someone needs some kind of something taken out, whatever, you name it. Their life is on the line. They can charge whatever you want, right? So every year, the company that would make that I work for, they would release these new lines of scopes, right, used in orthopedic surgery. What was the difference between and my job was looking at what was wrong with them, right? And what's the difference between the last year's line versus this year's line? It's like, what's the difference between the iPhone 8 versus the iPhone 9? Is the camera slightly better? It has a few more, whistles and stuff like that. But it's basically much of the time, it's innovation for the sake of just selling you something new. Sure. Right? So I think a lot of it would be, how do we redistribute so it's not just like, how do we manage what we have in the scheduling, right? But how do we redistribute the effort that's already there, right? So another thing in the U.S. is there's a shortage of general practitioners, right? So you can find Miami, right? You can find 1 million people who will give you butt surgery, butt implants, right? But there's probably a shortage of people who can check your blood pressure and tell you that you have hypertension, right? That's capitalism right there. Is that the way that money warps healthcare is that all the money is in specialization. So all the doctors gravitate towards some kind of specialization rather than basically what are people's needs, right? So I think a lot of the major change would be about how to rethink the allocation of kind of human resources and capital and energy. Where do we need development? Do we need the fanciest, latest camera used in surgery every single year to be, better HD, 4D, 3D, whatever? Or do we need to be reaching more people who have diabetes and, the basic solvable issues, right? I don't have deep answers for that, but I think that's the real heart of the matter.
No, I think that's great. But to me, that sounds like an argument for more statism, more centralization, more sort of planning, more deliberate central planning rather than more kind of everybody kind of figures out what they want to do, because then you get it's that's the problem that you're talking about is to me some of the problems of anarchism are some of the same problems of capitalism, in that you have all of these smaller actors that are kind of trying to figure out their own thing, and it's just
I don't think decentralization means that there's no coordination. I
Right.
think that democracy means that you can plan at a more higher level than the most immediate and local. I think that's. Some people put that forward, but I think that that's non-argument.
If what we're saying is we need to get the profit motive out and allocate based on human need, I don't think that sort of there's any disagreement between I don't think there's any disagreement on that point between like socialists of a more like statist bent and socialists of a more like libertarian bent. Like I think everybody kind of agrees on that part. It's just like, it's just sort of how do we how do we get everything to work? Is the question.
So in your view, you would think that hierarchy would somehow equate to consensus?
No, I think that in terms of like allocation, like he's talking about, okay, like, in the current system we have, we have all of this like unnecessary medical equipment being produced, and we have all of these doctors training as specialists because that's how you can earn more money rather than, and we have a shortage of like family doctors and general practitioners. Well, if we had a system where we said, okay, like, we got this many, we need this many radiologists, we need this many cardiologists, we need we need this many podiatrists or whatever, and we can based on like what the demand is or whatever. That just seems like sort of easier to run rather than I don't like this is all so complicated that it's sort of hard to talk about examples and counterexamples and what the contrast is, because none of us really know what the fuck we're talking about. I just for something that's as complicated and specialized and that requires as much like specialized equipment and specialized training and is as capital intensive as like the medical industry, you want to have a map and you want to be able to you want to have a spreadsheet and say okay, this is what we need here, this is what we need there, this is what we need there. So how we do that, I think there's a lot of room for democracy and for local input and but it's just there's it's just stuff's gotta work is like the point, I guess.
For me, I believe it's hard to study easy.
Okay.
A mí me parece, por ejemplo, una de las cosas más complicadas para tener ordenadamente.
One of the most complicated things
sería como tecnología espacial.
would be tecnología.
Espacial, outer space and stuff.
Okay, yeah. So spaceships, sort of more complex.
Pero la manera en que los japoneses lo hacen.
Like in the way the Japanese do it.
Yeah, tienen como diferentes gente que es un modelo pero lo comenzaron ellos, tienen diferentes pequeños laboratorios independientes que trabajan.
They have separate, I guess you could, not to directly translate, but labs or workspaces for people in different departments to work in, but
son pequeños, son completamente independientes uno de los otros.
Right.
Each one is independent from the next.
Y son unos cuantos, pero así como poner naves espaciales. Okay.
but they still manage to, push it out of space. Just because they're small doesn't negate the fact that they can still put in real work.
Si se puede hacer una equivalencia entre un modelo tan complejo como un hospital que significa tanto y esto existe, está ahí. O sea, el modelo de trabajo existe.
So that type of work exists. It's a different example, but there's something for a complicated sector.
Sí. Yo no quiero que la organización, una estructura descentralizada no implica desconexión entre sus elementos, sino implica otro tipo de organización. Pero esa experiencia ya está. No hay que traerla, no hay ni siquiera que inventarla. Solamente hay que potenciarla. No solamente la historia, sino el presente, porque está ahí.
You don't have to invent these forms of organization. They're already out there. It's just a question of kind of strengthening and raising them up?
Well, more like the people with expertise still exist. Like that expertise isn't going away just because you're not using, like straight down type managerial styles.
Right.
Yo creo que necesariamente para ocuparse de determinados problemas sociales, en este caso problemas médicos, yo puedo entender más, pero no quiero que se pueda reproducir.
No, I mean,
Porque
it doesn't necessarily.
no quiero que la centralización, y que es una cosa que ya se probó en el llamado comunismo real, la extrema centralización para tratar de resolver ciertos problemas sociales, entre ellos los médicos, y docentes, etc. Y eso sí provoca un desastre.
So like centralization has already been tried in the context of like actual communist states, and it was, they weren't successful. They were disasters.
O sea, no tendría sentido volver a repetir una cosa que ya probó ser desastrosa, que no va a crear un tipo de sociedad que estamos buscando. Entonces no tendría sentido pensar en las respuestas, sería otra. Y yo creo que hasta ahí, parte, o sea, que ya existe. Los capitalistas la emplean, es solamente reapropiarla, porque además ni siquiera es un modelo, yo no sé ni siquiera si es un modelo no creado por la historia del capitalismo, probablemente es un modelo también, en cierta forma, potenciado y desarrollado por la global del capitalismo, parte del sistema, de la historia del sistema.
Oh, yeah. So, not only have straight down hierarchies been used in communist systems, but they've been proven not to work in said systems. So, if they've already been proven not to work concretely over large periods of time, then why are you trying it again when the end goal isn't a hierarchy of that sort, when horizontal managerial styles do work and they're being implemented today within capitalist structures in more complicated fields than in medicine, because aerospace engineering is an extremely complicated field. So how could it be too complicated when it's already being implemented in these other very hard science-centric fields?
Quiero decir que voy a terminar. No quiero decir que la respuesta no es posible, pero me parece que el escenario presente no es, porque realmente no, las condiciones no están dadas para semejante implementación. En cualquier caso, en relación a lo que se está tratando de inyectar un elemento de mayor base democrática dentro de un proceso legislativo. Que eso no es para nada una situación ni socialista ni anarquista, una situación que se haga normal por la sociedad capitalista norteamericana contemporánea. O sea, se trata de una inyección de ciertas bases democráticas a un proceso legislativo, judicial, ¿no? ¿Quieres traducir eso?
The conditions are not necessarily
I don't
similar.
really like we're discussing like the perfect implementation of a federation or whatever into the actual system or the political system. We're talking about putting a little bit more of grassroots democracy into the process. So our limits are just there. We just can't jump over those limits, right? We're not discussing about having like an anarchist political system right now. It's not possible. Well, that would be crazy to address and make a discussion out of it. We're just discussing how to do it a little bit better given the certain conditions we have right now. That's what we're talking about now. It's my understanding, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So when we talk about, can you quote an example or just, we can do that, but that's not the point right now, right?
Right. No, I agree with that. So, like, one thing you were talking about was, there's no there's like the bill doesn't involve like protections for workers or like strengthening of like the healthcare unions or whatever. But like, I mean, my understanding is like what this bill does is it socializes the insurance system, and it doesn't really deal with it doesn't really deal with the medical system in any kind of way beyond that. All it does is it nationalizes the payment system for it. for this legislation to be able to provide something more to workers, it would have to go. It would have to be more of an NHS style thing where the government actually takes is actually taking on the responsibility of administering healthcare, and then we could say, okay, the workers are here's the workers are going to get to elect their representatives that deal with issues of how much they get paid and what their scheduling is like and what their all of the sort of worker issues, but I feel like that stuff isn't in there because all this bill really does is deal with it takes the sort of complex mishmash of healthcare payment systems that we have and just makes it one national payment system. But it doesn't do a lot for on the worker side of it, just because that's not it's fundamentally it doesn't, the government isn't taking over the provision of healthcare. So in order for the legislation to address issues of workers, it would actually it would have to be bigger in scope. The government would have to be doing more. So I guess that's sort of what I've been trying to say all along. That's the sort of fundamental tension in the critique or whatever.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in. I don't know if anyone else has comments. Yeah. So very quickly, for me, the whole thing is, yes, I'm critiquing the Medicare for All bill. Certainly I was kind of going point by point.
Right.
It's also a question of the movement. It's a question of what kind of language we're using. And, one of my problems, and this critique's been articulated elsewhere, is that the movement is sort of mobilizing people as voters to support, different politicians to kind of vote for this legislation. And also, I guess as consumers of healthcare. So, if we're a socialist of one type or another, where is or not even, but if we consider ourselves revolutionaries, some of us who are in the room, what is this aspect of, the working class, right, of organizing, something that's an alternative to capitalism. Right. And that's not completely, I'm not trying to put that on the bill. I don't expect any piece of legislation to get us there because it won't.
Right.
But, it's also a question of when we canvass, right, when we go to people, when we talk about this, what do we say about things like, that aspect that there's really not much for workers, perhaps it couldn't be covered in the bill, maybe the political capital isn't there, but, I also take issue with, mobilizing people in a way that I consider to be passive, which is just, okay, go and vote for the person who will vote for the bill that, might, if you have the right people implementing it, get us to this, better stage of healthcare that's still not really where we want it to be, but it's kind of like an intermediate step. So, that's kind of a lot of, you have a lot of intermediate layers there that, I don't love that as your organizing phrase. That's just kind of my take on it.
Right. To go back to 1936 famous, you just emphasize the extent to which a federal system was being established. You had some levels of centralization. You had some levels of decentralization. It seems any effective left strategy has to have hope. You can't just focus grassroots aspect absent national political aspect, because that's as realistic as just asking people to vote as consumers. Because what Payne is getting to, I think, is a really important set of points, is what this does is incredibly progressive in terms of how the healthcare system is going to be financed. Because you have a progressive financing mechanism. You're taxing the rich, much more than you're taxing middle class and working class. And it's progressive taxation system, which then sets up the conditions through which you have the opportunity to make it more democratic and decentralized, work better for communities. that depends on voices mobilized as proactive voices, proactive political voices. And this is the frustration I have with some of the anarchists, the question of just the dismissal of institutional politics. Because I look at Facebook, I read, various posts. I agree with a lot of what anarchists say about some of the solutions. I consider myself Libertarian Socialist, even part of the damn Libertarian Socialist Caucus within DSA. So I agree with this stuff.
Shout out to LSE. I think someone might be watching on Facebook now.
But it seems to me we do need to get our hands a little bit dirty, engage with institutional politics to a certain extent, because you're going to have to come up with solutions multifaceted. It's a lot better than having to combat at every opportunity what Trump has given us through this quasi-fascistic society. You could argue there's always kernels of fascism in the American state, but he is elevating them to new proportions. So we have a lot of rear guard battles we have to confront. We need to be better to actually have some progressive legislation with all its limitations, give us the opportunity to fight more effectively and keep in struggle, as opposed to just having to constantly fight rear guard action.
Else, anything? Well, so I'll jump in then. I just had a thought on that, which is, I feel like if you look at the history of major reforms, just in the context of U.S. politics, you kind of see where the strategies of, kind of working through institutions were, let's say, less than satisfying, to put it diplomatically. One example I'm thinking of is, the very founder of ESA, or one of the founders, Michael Harrington, during the 1960s, he worked with the Johnson administration on these, war on poverty programs.
Not a very inspiring history.
No, and the whole thing is, that came at a cost. Yeah, that came at a cost, which was, there were segments of the left that, they had to beat back criticism. So, for example, the Vietnam War, which was the damn thing that, that's why Social Security is in crisis even today, because to fund the Vietnam War, the government had to kind of raid funds from Social Security. So, there's this compromise that, yes, paper did get some very, very important programs, ones that helped a lot of people for a period. Of course, now in the context of neoliberalism having been kind of the dominant political force for a couple of decades, those programs have been kind of called out. We're talking about, say, Medicare, Medicaid, and so on. So, that's kind of what my mind goes to. That's a really tangible period of reform that it kind of carried the contradictions that sort of undermine the whole process, in my opinion. I don't know if it would exactly go the same way in the case of Medicare For All, but for me, it's something to think about. That's why I'm so skeptical. That's why I kind of hold on to that. Anyone else? Any closing comments? Okay, guys. Well, great discussion.